Well, so much is being spoken of in India about India potentially becoming the third largest economy in the world by 2027. Now, whether it's 2027 or 28 or maybe 2030, that is still contested. But the idea that India will be the third largest economy in the world seems in some senses inevitable. Now, the question is, and I'm interested in your perspective on this, is it a matter of just arithmetic inevitability as the Indian opposition claims, or do you think it also has to do at this moment from a global outlook to do with the kind of political stability that exists in India, current policies, which the government claims is what has propelled India from number 10 years ago to being the third largest economy in a few years from now?
So fascinating. First of all, I would just repeat what Gideon said. I consider Europe to be an integrated economy, and it is and will remain bigger than India. But if we consider countries formally defined, that is a perfectly plausible ambition. My expectation is that India's economy should be able to grow in real terms at about 6% a year or so over the next several years, and that ought to be the fastest growth of any really large economy. And it will therefore continue a relative rise. If you're asking, is this due to the present government or further back, I consider the turning point for the Indian economy to be the early 90s, and the trend has continued since then, and the growth has been slower since the financial crisis than before it, and that's been true over both administrations. So I think it's a quality of India itself. And finally, of course, I would stress that in achieving economically, of course, India has a very large number of challenges. Its industrial sector remains relatively weak. Its export sector has never rivaled what the Chinese have achieved. Unemployment is a very, very big problem in India. But yes, I think it's perfectly plausible that India will continue to rise and become, if we ignore Europe, the third most important economy in the world. But it will, and Gideon is clearly right, under almost any assumptions, remain far, far behind China and the US for at least the next 20 years and probably beyond that.
Gideon Rachman, one of the things that's been stressed during India's G20 presidency is the Prime Minister's attempt to make India the voice of the global South. Now, China has, over the past few decades, tried to build inroads with countries in Africa, South America, and elsewhere to make itself the natural leader of the global South. India is trying to give the African Union a permanent position in the G20, and that's pitched as one of the big ideas of the Indian presidency. Do you see this idea of India trying to be the voice of the global South leading to a contestation with China, which sees itself as the natural leader of the global South?
Yeah, I think there is an implicit contest going on there. I mean, I think the way that India's played it is very interesting because it's trying to have a foot both in the Western world camp and in the sort of global South camp, including organizations that are arguably increasingly dominated by China. So that, the BRICS summit, you would know better than me what India's attitude to the expansion of it was, but I think that it was certainly something pushed very, very hard by China, which I think now sees the BRICS as a potential alternative to the G7. And I think, incidentally, since we're talking about the G20, one thing to note is that after the big first leader summit of the G20, a lot of people said the G7 would disappear, that it was no longer relevant. And I think even in the West people felt that. But now I would say the US is putting considerable more energy into the G7 than to the G20 because it's strategically and politically a more coherent group. It's basically the Western world, and they are more likely to come up with real policies than the G20 is. I think for India, this idea of, for the moment, trying to keep a foot in both camps makes sense. Go to the BRICS, go to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also accept the invitations to the G7 summits, be a member of the Quad, because we don't know how these strategic rivalries are going to play out. And indeed, although what India's continuing relationship with Russia has clearly antagonized the West, the oil sales and so on, I think to some extent people in the West accept parts of the Indian argument that it's to everybody's benefit if there is a large country like India that kind of has relations with everybody. But I do wonder, in this period of rising tensions between the US and China, the Ukraine war, and now this kind of big question mark we've been asking about, well, what is Xi Jinping up to, both in his attitude to India as expressed through the G20, how long this straddle by India is going to be sustainable. At a certain point, is it going to be a situation where they are going to have to make some choices that so far they've really avoided?
Martin Wolf, even America is trying to ensure that the economic relationship with China doesn't degenerate to a point of no return. They're trying to keep the economic conversation going while accepting the element of competition and even a certain amount of adversity. Do you see India being able to continue to be a part of the Quad, be an invitee to the G7, and yet be a part of the SCO and BRICS? Or do you think at some point in time this trapeze will need to end and India would need to pick a side?
Well, I think I'd rather follow Gideon's view. India is, I think, quite cleverly trying to be a member of almost everything. And that is, I think, a position that it's probably it is more capable of being in that position than any other significant country. And good luck to it, as it were. The question, of course, is whether that's sustainable and whether it's effective. I'd like to stress the latter point. I'll come to both. On the sustainability, it's sustainable so long as the rivalries between dominant powers, which are shaping the transformation of current global politics and economics, remain manageable and containable. In other words, so long as you don't have to choose which side to belong to. And that's where we are now, and I very much hope we will remain there, that it doesn't get to that point. And in that situation, India can, of course, try to be part of everything. Then you get to the question of effectiveness. You talk particularly about the leadership of the Global South, which brings me back very much to my childhood days and youthful days when there was the global non-aligned movement and India was a leader of the global non-aligned movement. And the question really is there geopolitically such a thing as the Global South? I don't like the phrase anyway, but I'll leave that aside. I just don't think geopolitically there is. The Global South contains the vast majority of human beings, and they have vastly divergent interests, positions, economic, geopolitical. And the one thing they do share is they want more from the global north. And in that sense, India can try to lead that group to some extent. But basically, the global south is not, and Gideon suggested that, a coherent grouping. And the very fact that China and India are both vying to be leaders of it sort of suggests that fact. So I would say that India should do the best it can with this position, exploit every opportunity it can, but it's probably not going to be a completely effective geopolitical strategy, and I'm reasonably certain that the Modi government understands that.